So I thought that, Mike, it would be good to just start by asking you for your 1 minute dinner table breakdown of what big oil is up to behind the scenes right now. Like, pretend that we're people that know nothing about this.
So, as a growing number of communities across the country are taking big oil companies to court to hold them accountable for lying about climate change and make them pay for the damages that these companies have knowingly caused, the companies are in total panic mode. And as more and more cases are getting closer to trial, they are now running to Congress for a get out of jail free card.
What does that look like? What is a get out of jail free card?
So there's something called a liability waiver, which is, to put it really simply, Congress can say this industry is above the law. You cannot sue these folks for these reasons. And that's a very rare thing. There are only a few precedents for what the oil industry is trying to get. One of them that their allies have pointed to directly is the protection given to gun manufacturers in 2005 is a law called PLACA, the Protection for Lawful Commerce in Arms Act. And, that law in particular has really been a nightmare for folks trying to get justice for victims of gun violence and their families. But I can elaborate on sort of what big oil is specifically going for here. And I don't know how much background on the lawsuits itself is helpful just to set the
We're
context.
going to get into
We'll get
this.
there.
Okay.
Yeah.
But really, this is something that the companies have been after ever since the first climate deception lawsuits were filed against them in 2017. There were proposals going back to then that Exxon and other major oil companies signed on to for a carbon tax that had a catch in them, which is they would also provide liability relief to oil companies that all of a sudden had this evidence out that they not only knew about climate change decades ago, but had actively deceived the public. And they knew they were going to face legal action as a result. We've seen in 2020 language that would shield oil companies from lawsuits that was put into draft COVID relief legislation. It got stripped after Democrats in the House called it out. But now that President Trump has come back into office and there is a Republican trifecta and a fossil fuel friendly administration, even before Trump entered office, if you're unfortunate enough like me to follow the sort of fever swamp of pro-fossil fuel media, you just saw all this signaling about how climate lawsuits threaten President Trump's energy dominance agenda. And we need to shield American energy from these legal challenges. And then soon after Trump comes into office, he met with oil executives who asked him specifically to help on this issue. Essentially, where we are today in 2026 is the oil lobby is actively pushing draft legislation. They've had at least one House Republican say they're working to bring some type of proposal that would essentially try to shield the companies as much as possible from any accountability, both in court and through legislation. And they've specifically pointed to climate deception lawsuits and climate superfund laws as the things they're trying to shield oil companies from.
So let's take it one by one. What's your 101 on what is a climate deception lawsuit?
So one of the best ways to think about these cases that oil and gas companies are facing these are like lawsuits against tobacco or opioid companies, right? Corporations knew their product would cause harm. In the case of fossil fuels, it was intensifying the climate crisis. They lied to the public through, in the case of the fossil fuel industry, the most consequential corporate deception campaign of all time. And now these lawsuits are saying the companies should be held accountable and pay for the damage that they've caused in various ways. Today, there are 11 states and dozens of communities across the United States that together cover 1 in 4 people living in the United States that is suing big oil in one way or another to hold them accountable for lying about climate change, lying about their product's role in fueling the climate crisis, and to make them pay for the damages.
What does holding them accountable mean? What are these lawsuits seeking overall?
So these are different lawsuits brought in different courts under different laws. Some of them are saying, hey, our communities are facing greater risks from wildfires, sea level rise, floods, droughts. It's going to cost us a lot of money to protect residents from those harms. And the companies that knowingly cause these damages, they should have to pay to help us do that, right? The same way that tobacco companies were made to pay for the public health harms that they knowingly caused. There are some lawsuits that are brought under consumer protection grounds that say, hey, in our state, our consumer protection law says you can't sell a product and lie to consumers about that product. You violated our state consumer protection law. Michigan this year just filed a major antitrust lawsuit in federal court against some of these same companies, saying, you oil companies who should be competitors in the marketplace, you actually conspired to rig the marketplace to lock in fossil fuels and block clean energy competition. And what that has done is it's fueled the affordability crisis for people in Michigan because now consumers have fewer choices because of your antitrust conspiracy. So there are many, many different forms of legal threats that the oil and gas industry is facing right now. You know, ExxonMobil is getting sued in California for lying about the recyclability of their plastic products. Exxon's a major manufacturer of the plastic polymers that go into single-use plastics, right? And so as more and more evidence against these companies comes out through whistleblowers, journalists, congressional investigations, there are just more and more legal actions to hold them accountable, to make them stop deceiving the public about the true nature of their business, the harms their own scientists warned them would occur through the unabated use of fossil fuels. And if these cases are successful, the companies could be on the hook for billions and billions of dollars because, you know, now we're at a place where in 2026, it's estimated that climate damages are costing U.S. taxpayers about $1 trillion a year, right? And so shouldn't the companies that made this mess help to pay to clean it up?
So the push for immunity by the oil industry is essentially a push to make it so they don't have to individually fight all of these efforts in court. They don't have to be subject to the whims of, let's say, a certain judge or a certain court. They want some type of legislation or assurance that they can't be sued at all. So let's talk about the different avenues that the oil industry is pushing for immunity. How are they trying to do this?
Yeah, so big oil companies saw what happened to tobacco companies, right? They saw what happened to opioid manufacturers that have faced lots of successful lawsuits where they've been held accountable for the harms caused by their products. And they don't want to be next. So they have not been completely successful in court, right? Many of these lawsuits are now moving forward toward discovery and trial. And so what the companies are doing is going outside of court. They're going to the legislative branch to say, hey, can you pass a law that says we can't be sued, right? And they're rushing to do this before they have to face the evidence of what they've done in court, before a jury sees this evidence. So on the national level, the American Petroleum Institute, the biggest oil lobbying group, has reported through their own lobbying disclosures that they are lobbying on draft legislation on this issue. They said publicly at the beginning of the year that one of their top priorities for 2026 is to stop all climate liability. And recently, we saw one House Republican, Representative Harriet Hageman from Wyoming, come out on her own and say, I am working with colleagues in both the House and the Senate on legislation that would tackle climate lawsuits and climate superfund laws. And we have not seen that bill yet, but what she said about her aims here and her goals echoes much of what we've heard from the fossil fuel industry and its allies over the last years. It was very interesting. She was asked by a reporter, did you talk to anyone in the industry about your proposal? And she told E&E News, no, I haven't. And I just have to say, that is like such a huge coincidence that she hasn't talked to anyone in the oil and gas industry, because exactly what she has proposed is the thing they've been dreaming for, is the thing they have asked President Trump to help them with, is the thing that 16 Republican attorney generals sent a roadmap to Pam Bondi for last summer. So it's just an awful coincidence that there is a member of Congress that is just coincidentally willing to give the oil and gas industry what they want without talking to them. It's crazy how that works.
And has this member of Congress taken any money from the oil and gas industry, campaign contributions?
Well, that's a great question. I think an easy search might reveal some stuff there.
We can look into that.
Quick question for you, Mike. So you talked about there are 11 states and dozens of local and tribal governments that have these lawsuits currently going through the court system. You talked about the fossil fuel industry wanting to get this immunity in place before these cases see a judge and jury. Can you talk a little bit about the timeline where we're at on that? Like, how soon could some of these suits start actually going through discovery? Could we see court action on these cases versus when this potential immunity clause or, this immunity shield could be in place on a federal level?
Yeah, so, the fossil fuel companies have fought for years to beat these cases in court, and they have sort of a mixed record, but many of these cases have prevailed against their arguments to get them tossed, right? So some of the cases that are at the front of the line right now, you have places like Honolulu, Hawaii, has filed a lawsuit against major oil and gas companies like Exxon and Chevron and others that's seeking to make the companies pay for local climate damages there. The Hawaii Supreme Court has unanimously said that that case can move toward discovery and trial. And last year, the U.S. Supreme Court refused to take up an oil industry petition in that case. So that's one that's sort of at the front of the line moving forward. You also have consumer protection cases. The one that's at the front of the line there is the state of Massachusetts filed a consumer protection case against Exxon that we could perhaps see go to trial as soon as 2027. And you have this growing number. There have been lots of sort of earlier disputes in the lawsuits over jurisdiction. These cases, they mostly get filed in state court. The oil companies try to move them to federal court. They've been unsuccessful at that. Now we're at a point where these cases are actually getting close to the merits of what they're arguing, and they get to a stage called the motion to dismiss, right? And this is where courts are simply saying, the case that you're pleading, should it get to advance toward discovery and trial, right? Make it ahead, where the oil companies are saying, no, please dismiss them at this stage. There's a growing number of cases that have passed that motion to dismiss. So you have Honolulu, you have Massachusetts, you have states like Connecticut and Vermont, you have Minnesota, the District of Columbia. And I think most importantly for this year and related to this conversation, the city and county of Boulder, because the Colorado Supreme Court said that Boulder's lawsuit against Exxon and Suncor Energy could proceed to discovery and trial. But then just a few weeks ago, the U.S. Supreme Court, after turning down 5 previous requests to take up one of these cases since 2023, granted Exxon and Suncor's request to review that Colorado Supreme Court ruling. So that case is going to be heard in the fall, likely in October, and there would be a ruling next year. However, for the oil and gas industry, they are not putting all their eggs in this basket because nobody knows how the Supreme Court's going to rule in that case, and we could get into the details of it if helpful. But what's important to know is that when we talk about all the different types of liability these companies are facing, there's different types of lawsuits making different arguments. There's climate superfund laws that have passed in 2 states and are being proposed in more. When you look at all these different types of liability for the companies, a win at the Supreme Court, even in one case, is not going to make all their legal headaches go away. And so that's why they're making this play right now for a complete, total blanket immunity, get out of jail free card. And we have not seen what that language is, but we've had some hints of how expansive they want it to be.
What are the hints?
So I think the closest thing we've seen to a roadmap is last summer, 16 Republican attorneys general sent a letter to Pam Bondi where they outlined different things the administration and other branches of government could do to essentially stop communities who have filed these lawsuits. One of the things they called for specifically was they used the term a liability shield, and they said it would be similar to that 2005 law that protected gun manufacturers. They say that in their letter. Another tactic that they outlined was the federal government could restrict funding to states and local governments that try to hold big oil accountable in court. And we actually, very soon after that, saw House Republicans insert into appropriation language a line that would have restricted the District of Columbia, because of course Congress gets to control the purse strings of Washington, D.C. D.C. has a consumer protection case against Exxon and other companies. That's one of these cases that have passed motions to dismiss. So this House Appropriations proposal had a line that said, prohibit any funds in D.C. from being spent on consumer protection laws, from enforcing D.C.'s consumer protection laws against oil and gas companies over environmental claims, right? So that was taken straight from that playbook. That effort did not succeed. That appropriations language did not go forward, but it's one of the many signs we've seen that this is something where the fossil fuel industry is calling in every favor it can, and they're pressing every level of government.
So it's my understanding that
we haven't talked about yet, but should get to also is this meeting with President Trump about a year ago, because that is really where publicly a lot of this came up.
I mean,
go for it.
I mean, we can talk about it. Like, what else has President Trump done to put his thumb on the scale of supporting the fossil fuel industry to combat these types of legal challenges?
So people might remember infamously during the campaign, Trump said to oil and gas executives, give me $1 billion and I'll do whatever you want. Oil executives in their first White House meeting with Trump in this current term, it was reported by the Wall Street Journal, what was top of their mind and what they asked for his administration's help with wasn't deregulation, right? Wasn't blocking climate action because they're not too worried about that in this current Congress. It was helping them escape these lawsuits, right? And that is not something that the president can do unilaterally. But what President Trump did days after that meeting was reported was he issued an executive order directing Attorney General Pam Bondi to take all appropriate action to try to stop these lawsuits that, in the words of the executive order, could impose crippling damages on the companies. And soon after that, the Trump DOJ, under Bondi, filed these truly unusual, and I mean that is a polite word for these lawsuits, they filed 2 lawsuits against states that had not yet sued big oil, but whose officials said, we are planning to sue fossil fuel companies. That was all the information they had to go on, and they filed preemptive lawsuits against Michigan and Hawaii, whose officials said they were going to bring these lawsuits to say, whatever you're doing, you can't do it, right? And asking a court to stop them. Now, Michigan and Hawaii went ahead and filed their lawsuits anyway. Hawaii filed theirs the next day. The lawsuit against Michigan has since been dismissed by a court, and Hawaii's is still pending. But the other thing that the Trump Bondi DOJ did was they started filing briefs in support of the companies in these lawsuits. And in fact, when the companies asked for the 6th time, right, since 2023, trying to get the Supreme Court to take up one of these issues, the Trump administration filed an uninvited brief, a very rare thing in Supreme Court cases, urging the court to take this case out of Boulder, to listen to Suncor and Exxon's arguments in the Boulder case. And we don't know what ultimately persuaded the justices to take the case this time, when a year ago they had a chance to take essentially the same exact question that was in front of them. But clearly that was one of the factors that had changed. The other was that Justice Alito, who owned stock in oil companies facing these lawsuits, did not recuse himself.
So the administration's argument, a translation of the oil industry's argument, is that holding these oil companies accountable for climate damages would cause crippling financial damages to those companies. However, it seems to me that those crippling financial damages, they're going to be imposed on somebody either way. It's either the fossil fuel companies are going to pay for them or communities are going to pay for them. Can you talk about some of the specific damages that communities are trying to have big oil be held accountable for? Put another way, what are the real consequences for communities if big oil is successful in achieving immunity? What are they going to have to pay?
So look, courts are one of the only avenues that local governments have to recover damages. If any party causes you harm, in America, you have the right to take them to court and make your case for why they should pay, right? What big oil is trying to do here is say, well, we should be above that law. We should get special treatment. We should be exempt, right? And I think anyone who has any notion of fairness and justice should just be appalled at that idea. Emily, you're right. Someone is paying for climate damages right now, and that someone is everybody else. It's not the oil and gas companies, right? U.S. taxpayers, the latest estimates are $1 trillion a year in climate damages. The case that the Supreme Court's going to look at later this year is a great example. Boulder, Colorado, in 2018, files this lawsuit where they say, we are having to spend more and more money to protect our residents from climate damages. And one of the things they cite is the increased risk to wildfires in the West. 3 years later, parts of Boulder County are hit by the Marshall Fire, the most destructive wildfire in Colorado history. People are killed. More than 1,000 homes are burned to the ground. This is the new climate reality, right? That big oil knew decades ago that if they didn't change course, communities were going to be facing, right? In their own internal documents, they say, if we keep doing what we're doing, potentially catastrophic events, right? More violent weather. And this is now what communities all across the country, whether they're floods, fires, droughts, storms, this is what we're dealing with. And it didn't have to be this way, right? The companies could have changed course. They could have shared what they knew. They could have done what they falsely claimed to be doing and actually lead clean energy solutions. But they chose not to do that. They lied and they stole generations worth of time when we could have reduced our dependence on fossil fuels, right? Because now people are paying for it two different ways, right? As we're going through this moment where oil and gas prices are very much on the minds of lots of people, we have to ask, why are we so reliant on fossil fuels? Why is this being so disruptive to the global economy? And it's because the industry that sells those products has fought for years to keep us hooked on those products. So now we're paying for it two ways. We're paying for it at the gas pump, and we're paying for it in $1 trillion in climate damages. So this is clearly an industry that has caused monumental harm to everyday people's pocketbooks, to municipal infrastructure, to government budgets, right? And they need to be held accountable for that.
You talked about how President Trump, the DOJ, members of Congress are trying to support these efforts to help the industry get this liability shield. Can you talk a little bit more about how on the state level, what's happening on that level to help protect the fossil fuel industry? I know there's been some recent developments, especially in Utah. Can you mention that?
Yeah, really, the fossil fuel industry and its allies are leaving no stone unturned here, right? So they're going to the White House and they're saying, help us get out of these lawsuits. They're going to the Supreme Court and they're saying, can you please kill this lawsuit? They're going to Congress and they're saying, can you please kill all these lawsuits? Now they are going to state legislatures across the country, lobbying state lawmakers and state houses and saying, hey, while we're over here trying to get a get out of jail free card on the federal level, we would like one in your state. And we're seeing this very dangerous and alarming trend happening very quickly, where a growing number of states are introducing and passing essentially state level immunity bills for the fossil fuel industry. The governor of Utah just signed the first one into law. The Tennessee legislature has passed one that's now heading towards the governor. States like Oklahoma, Louisiana, Iowa are not far behind, and we expect it's not going to end there. So this is, again, a really alarming trend, because what this is doing for citizens in those states is it's saying, you are now going to be saddled with all the costs, right? You have no tools, no court access to hold polluters accountable, to hold corporations accountable when they mislead the public. I mean, this should really be ringing alarm bells, and I think be a bigger scandal than it has been, because it's happening very quickly. And this is the way the fossil fuel industry wants it to be, right? They're trying to do this quietly. They don't want to draw a lot of attention to it. And what, folks like myself and others who work in this space, it's basically like trying to track a shark that occasionally it's rearing its head above water, and you get hints of what's happening behind closed doors and in these lobbying campaigns. But now we're seeing the real world stuff happening because these state laws are being passed and there's open talk of congressional legislation.
When you mentioned earlier that you are keeping track of the right-wing news sphere to see what arguments the Trump administration and their allies are making in favor of big oil liability. How have you heard, are they trying to convince the Trump base that potential crippling financial damages to oil companies are more important than the potential crippling financial damages of climate change? I think
Yeah,
I know the answer, but
it's a fascinating question. I mean, I think in some ways the communications here on this specific issue, it's not being targeted towards the base, right? Their audience are decision makers. They're trying to get lawmakers to bail them out, right? They're trying to get allies in the Trump administration to care about these lawsuits. But when you see the arguments being made, there's been an interesting shift, I think, from the industry front groups since President Trump came back into office, where for many years you saw the oil industry front groups, the critics of climate deception lawsuits, coming out and saying, hey, look, surely we need to do something about climate change, but this lawsuits, shouldn't be the way to do it. And they would sort of mischaracterize them as trying to solve climate change, which, to be clear, these lawsuits are not trying to reduce emissions. They're not trying to solve climate change. In the words of one attorney general, this isn't about solving climate change. This is about surviving it, right? We still need comprehensive climate action. We still need to speed the clean energy transition. All these lawsuits are saying is these companies have to stop lying and they have to pay for damages that they've caused, right? But so we've seen this shift now from the front groups where instead of saying the industry could be partners on innovation, right? Like that favorite buzzword. And you should be working with companies on sort of innovative solutions to climate change. When President Trump came into office, there was really, I think, a deliberate shift to appeal to the president and his allies themselves to frame this in terms of American energy dominance, right? And trying to further polarize this and depict it as accountability for the oil and gas industry would be a threat to President Trump's energy dominance agenda. And I'll give you one of my favorite examples of their sort of desperation to socialize this message was we're speaking soon after CERAWeek, when all the oil and gas executives, meet and they talk through the issues that are on their mind and they plan the continued destruction of the climate and everything else. At last year's CERAWeek, there was literally a billboard truck driving around the building that the oil and gas executives were meeting in. And this is, you had Trump administration officials, you had a lot of very important people in the building. And one of the ways they were trying to reach this crowd with this message was a billboard truck that had something to the extent of Stop Climate Lawfare on its sign. And it had a URL to a group that is essentially a fossil fuel industry group, right? So they're trying to cast this in sort of this is blue state lawfare. They're trying to cast it in partisan terms. They're trying to cast it in terms that I think appeal to this administration, right? And echo a lot of the language that they're saying. But let's not forget that President Trump supported the oil companies in his first term as well. Like literally on his last day in office, the last time the U.S. Supreme Court looked at one of these cases, it was a very technical matter in a lawsuit from the city of Baltimore. Trump administration lawyers were arguing right beside the lawyers for Exxon and Chevron in front of the Supreme Court in 2021. So this is not a new thing that the Trump administration is supporting big oil in these cases. But I think what is new is you see this urgency now that the cases are getting closer to trial and the companies are realizing we are getting very close to having to face a jury. And that is the last place that we want to be. I think one of the most revealing comments to me was one of Exxon's top lawyers in these cases, a guy named Justin Anderson, was on a Federalist Society panel recently, and he was talking about this. And in his own words, he said, as Exxon's lawyer, I have to win every case. And he explained how this is such a huge priority, not just for ExxonMobil, but for the entire industry. And if you're thinking in terms of I have to win every case, what is easier, playing whack-a-mole in courthouses across the country or going to Congress and getting a total get-out-of-jail-free card, right? And so it's very clear what their wish would be. And we know because they've tried this in the past that this is what they ultimately want.
So what does it say, if anything, about big oil that they're pushing this hard for immunity?
If you've done nothing wrong, why do you need immunity? If you're saying we need to be above the law, doesn't that imply you've perhaps done something that violated the law? I mean, I think you look pretty guilty when you're saying we need total immunity in these cases. And what's really scary to think about is your audience knows about a lot of the bad behavior that fossil fuel companies have engaged in over the years. Let's imagine a world where all of a sudden Congress says, actually, those companies, the law doesn't apply to them, right? No mechanisms to hold them accountable for their role in the climate crisis. How much worse do we think their behavior will get when they're given that sort of get out of jail free card?
So is the only way for this immunity shield to actually become a reality is for Congress to basically slip it into a bill and vote for it? Is that what we're looking at here? And how realistic is that?
This is a great question, right? And what are the different avenues that the oil industry could attempt to try to get this passed? So we've had one House Republican, Harriet Hageman, say that she is working on crafting legislation to do this. But it's unclear whether a standalone bill like that is really going to be the most advantageous vehicle for the oil and gas industry. I think they know that this is hugely unpopular, right? And it's also happening in a context where lots of other industries, AI, pesticide, are actually engaged in similar lobbying campaigns right now, where there's this sort of corporate feeding frenzy of industries saying, hey, can we be above the law? Can we get immunity? Can we get a liability shield? And there's been enormous bipartisan pushback against both AI immunity and pesticide immunity. I think this proposal, because it hasn't seen the light of day, a lot of folks are sort of like, well, when it's a thing, then we'll talk about it. But to your point, Tracy, the oil and gas industry is not going to want to draw a lot of attention to this, right? That attorney general letter that we were talking about that they sent to Pam Bondi outlining the game plan for what a liability shield could look like. Here's another great coincidence. After folks like me saw that letter and news outlets reported on it, it miraculously disappeared from the West Virginia Attorney General's website.
Well, I'm sure groups like Meta would really like an immunity shield, given the reality of their own situation. I mean, yeah, if every industry just starts coming to Congress saying, I want an immunity shield, like, what's the point?
I want an immunity shield.
Yeah, right?
Right.
I could do anything.
Right. And I think when we're talking about pathways, something really significant happened this week, which was Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, one of the biggest climate champions on the Hill, in reaction to the news that Utah had passed the first state immunity law for the fossil fuel industry. He posted online, if you try this at the national level, it's going to blow up permitting negotiations, right? Which he's been an active member in those bipartisan negotiations. So this is now officially one of those issues that is out there that is being talked about among members of Congress as a potential deal breaker, right? And so it's really important for all members of Congress who agree that corporations shouldn't be above the law, I think, to make their voices heard and just make sure that if language is introduced, it's just dead on arrival. Just to give you just another sense of how clear the industry's signaling that they've wanted this is, before there was even that Wall Street Journal story that the oil and gas industry was asking President Trump for help and was hoping to get a legal shield in a coming Trump-endorsed bill. Folks in the climate accountability space, where I work at the Center for Climate Integrity and other groups, we knew the oil and gas industry was going to use this political moment to try to win a liability shield. And one of the things that was organized very early last year was nearly 200 groups sent a letter to the Democratic leaders in Congress, to Chuck Schumer and to Hakeem Jeffries, and say, we know from prior history the fossil fuel industry is going to try to get a liability waiver. And your caucuses need to be on the lookout for this, and they need to unite and be against it, because this would be so harmful for communities everywhere, right? It would set a very dangerous legal precedent saying corporations get these special rights, and it would just be another thing to fuel the affordability crisis, because it's going to put all the costs of climate change back on taxpayers.
I think we have a really powerful example of how damaging this could be to victims of climate change by just looking at the gun industry, and the gun industry having already achieved legal immunity. Have you looked into, or can you speak to, what legal immunity has meant for gun violence victims?
Yeah, this is an area that others know a lot more about than me, but I can just say broadly, this has been a major obstacle for folks who have tried to get justice for the victims of gun violence and their families. Under PLACA, certain legal avenues are shut down, and there are cases that have been brought that have been dismissed under PLACA grounds And there's even been really dangerous examples where, to cite one example, parents of someone who was killed in gun violence brought a lawsuit. It was dismissed under PLACA. And then those parents had to pay damages for having brought a lawsuit. So,
God.
you can just imagine how much of a nightmare this could be if an industry as wealthy and powerful and harmful as the fossil fuel industry were to get these kinds of legal protection, and how much worse their behavior would get.
You mentioned that Sheldon Whitehouse has basically said, he will hold permitting hostage if this tries to move forward on the national level. What are other strategies that the other side is using to combat some of these efforts to pass this immunity shield?
The other side meaning folks who support climate accountability.
Yes, exactly.
Yes.
Your side.
Yes. Okay.
What else? Like Sheldon
So-
Whitehouse has basically said, I will hold permitting hostage. What else is being done by Democratic leaders in Congress to push back against these efforts from the right side of the aisle?
The most important thing for anyone listening right now who's alarmed about this is that they themselves contact their members of Congress. And we and other groups have a campaign landing page, No Immunity for Big Oil, where folks can learn more about this issue. And there are also opportunities to take action. Groups like the Sierra Club, the Union of Concerned Scientists, a lot of our partners have online actions set up to make it easy for you to contact your member of Congress to learn about this issue, to speak out about it. Because frankly, we all know we're living in very chaotic times. There are many, many threats to people's rights, to our well-being, to our health, to our economy happening right now. And you can imagine if you're a member of Congress or someone working in one of these offices, it's just constant fire drills, right? And we know that in these chaotic times, bad actors can exploit the confusion to try to rush through bad legislation. And so this is why we need members of Congress to be on alert and to be aware and be looking out for this threat. And so the most important thing folks can do is really raise an alarm about this, share news about it online, go to noimmunityforbigoil.org to learn how to do that.
In relation to that, can you, in plain language, make the case that big oil's push for immunity from these lawsuits is worth paying attention to right now in this political moment as we're in multiple global conflicts over oil?
What's really dangerous to think about is we are not talking about big oil being above the law for 1 year or one presidential term. If they were able to get something like this passed through Congress, it could potentially be for all time. All of a sudden, big oil is placed above the law, and any laws or lawsuits that seek to hold them accountable, frankly, in any way, because we don't know how far-reaching it could be, could all of a sudden be overridden. And that's going to be extremely dangerous as communities facing an accelerating climate crisis, trying to make polluters pay, trying to hold corporations accountable, are going to be forced to pay for the rising bills from climate change and have no outlet, no mechanism, no tools that they previously had. And it's also going to set a really dangerous precedent that other industries could follow.
Mike, question for you. If climate change isn't real and it's not causing any damages to any communities, then why would big oil need immunity from lawsuits over climate damages if they're not real?
It's a great question. And if they're so confident the law is on their side and they've done nothing wrong and they're not scared of the evidence against them, why would they need immunity?
I assume that they think that it's because certain judges are also in on the climate conspiracy theory and they're going to hold them accountable for things that aren't real. And it occurs to me that there might be, and I think that there are, some efforts to make sure that judges can't take into consideration climate science, or they have less good information about climate science, right? I feel like that's part of this too.
Yes, and I'm so glad you brought that up because it actually goes back to something, when Tracy was asking about other things in Congress. I'm rattling off a lot of ways that they have specifically been lobbying for immunity. But this is all part of a greater ecosystem where what the oil and gas industry, their front groups, and their political allies have tried to do for years is attack any actor involved in these lawsuits. So they've launched various attacks on the communities bringing the cases, the lawyers representing those communities, the judges hearing these cases, groups that support these cases. I think my favorite example of this was last year, Ted Cruz held this, frankly, farcical subcommittee hearing that was all based on the premise that climate lawsuits in the United States are actually being bankrolled by the Chinese Communist Party, right? They had this big hearing. No other Republicans showed up to join Ted Cruz in making these accusations, but they had this big hearing that was able to generate a lot of headlines in right-wing information spaces, blaming the Chinese Communist Party for climate lawsuits. And when an NPR reporter asked Senator Cruz's office to provide any evidence to back up his claim, a staffer sent a statement that NPR was able to show was written by ChatGPT.
Awesome.
So that's just one example here. But yes, Emily, we've seen attacks on judges themselves. We have seen attacks on the groups that are trying to provide education on climate science, right? Because just having a baseline understanding of what is climate change, how does it work? These are important issues. And the organizations that provide judicial education to judges have acknowledged as much, have said, if judges are going to be ruling on more and more of these cases, like any other issue, they need a baseline understanding. But what Big Oil wants is for all of us to continue operating in ignorance, for anyone who tries to hold them accountable to be defamed and discredited. So, pushing for immunity is their ultimate goal, but they're really doing everything at every stage of the game that they can to attack any effort to hold them accountable for the greatest corporate fraud in history.